Oluwole, that I'll now hand over to Ruduan for the presentation to put this in the context of, you know, where did we start? What were we trying to resolve at the time? You know, how can we now look back at the achievement of the journey that we traveled? And then after that, we'll still go to the presentation of Mariam. And meanwhile, as we were speaking, Aliyah had good news. Do you want to announce that, Aliyah? Or should I read it?
Yes, sure. So basically, I've got a message from Lawrence, who is working at LUMC, that Andrea's space have been. So there are 2 accounts that set up for Ezra and Oluwole in Andrea's space. So can basically start working in Andrea already.
And I think set up as a web server, and then of course everybody else can also be included because we have no limit. So it's really meant as a workbench, but we're just trying step by step to put that whole place in order. So we are certainly now hoping to set up the web server with Oluwole and Ezra there, and then to have announce a strategy next week, how all of those that need to be in the workbench can be there. So thanks, Aliyah. With that, I hand over to you, Ruduan. You have the share screen, and looking forward to your presentation now.
Yes, sure, thank you. That's a great presentation, Oluwole. Let me share my screen. Just one moment. Yeah, can you all see it?
Yes, we can.
Maximize, okay. So I'll be taking a bit of a step back and really look also from my perspective, just my own research, but also more general, you know, an overview of what we're actually trying to achieve and how we should also kind of communicate this, especially to other parties who may not be as technically savvy, but they are really involved in this important decision making, and their level of expertise is what we need to make this technology really useful and also as powerful as it can be. So my research is more focused now on interval data systems. So this means data systems that can talk to each other, can also work with each other. And I think this is really at the center of what we're trying to do. So for some context, this is especially relevant, also VC as mentioned, that like in the last meeting, he mentioned that there's a kind of disconnect between really the academic world, really the high level technology and the complexity that comes with it, and the society. And you can also think about people outside of this domain, but you can also think about policymakers and just regular, ordinary, everyday people. So some examples of this, like the damage that this disconnect can do is, for example, we have, say, surveillance technology. It can really make people's lives better by making streets more safe. But at the other hand, people, and especially policymakers, have also realized that this technology can also be used for nefarious purposes. Like, for example, if you have a facial scanning, you can do stuff like ethnic profiling. And this is already used in some countries, and this is something we should all really be concerned about. A more local example, of course, is the GGD. They had really set up a medical information system really quickly surrounding Corona to get a good grasp of the testing that's being done, and also to archive per person, for example, do you have to go in quarantine or not? But the value they brought by setting up this so quickly is the safety and the medical efficacy, but also the damage they did by doing that so fast is that they made it really risky, and this eventually caused a data leak. And this was simply caused by an open resource, and it wasn't even something that really needed a sophisticated actor to exploit. So this should always be taken into account, and it's the same with what we're doing. And this is especially important why we're also looking at this constantly, looking at the controls, looking at the permissions, and also really critically auditing and also involving in the entire process the people of all the layers, and not just have us as technicians come together and only look from that perspective, because then the technology doesn't really get integrated into all those different levels. So yeah, with that, I'll also bring the unfortunate general trend that with every positive development you have in technology that can bring a lot of value to people, that can bring, for example, good health, better energy, it also often has very negative societal reality. And this is often unintended. For example, you have different projects, especially regarding AI. You have that can automate things, but can also automate nefarious things. And this should not just require you to handle after the fact, but you should be looking forward. Like, if I finish this, what is the effect going to be 5 years from now? What are the different use cases that can be used? And in what different ways might it also be abused? Can we limit that possibility of parties abusing it? And this is very powerful about VODAN, because our starting point is that people own their own data, that we're not going to look at their data, that everything they share is something that they can actually look into, that they approved, and that they know what's going to happen with their data. And they're not just participating, for example, in research, and then their data gets taken. They don't have any advantage from the knowledge that gets gained, and then it disappears somewhere in a void. And this is really what we want to avoid, especially like in the modern global world. We want to have a research that can benefit everyone, and especially those that really provide the information. We have to collaborate together. And the collaboration is not going to happen if certain parties just take without giving. So we really have to look at it in reverse. Can we identify from the positive socioeconomic interactions from the technology, can we also identify the opportunities that it might be exploited? And by looking at those opportunities for exploitation, this is kind of what you could call a hacker mindset. You are not actually looking to exploit it yourself, but you're looking at ways to circumvent that, to create new solutions that turn those negative things into positive development. And this is exactly what VODAN is about. We look at this negative event that's happening, that data is just being, you could call it theft, or it's being taken without really transparency. And this is just, keeps draining on, usually from countries that are less economically powerful, often to economic powerhouses like the US. And they get all this knowledge, they don't share back, and this creates a really negative loop. And through this insight, you can also think, how can we encourage people to be more working in a methodology that is collaborative? And this is really what the federated data methodology is about. Can we share knowledge with each other without exposing our data, without this risk of not only giving away our research data itself, but also the risk of exposing people's privacy? For example, with that, give people the possibility to have identity theft, being taken advantage of, and being coerced. All these negative different things that might come later, we're trying to prevent that from the very technological level. So one of the things that I believe is relevant to this is a research we did 2 years ago with a group of students. So what we found was that we had a lot of open source intelligence data surrounding Uganda. The conflict started around 97, sorry. And there were a lot of different reports being made, for example, on radio, on television, newspapers. So what the organization actually did, they gathered all these information sources together without any bias. So they just took it as is. And then they provided this as a kind of open source information. So this is not private data, but this is data that's already out there. But from this data, we can actually bring positive value by evaluating against each other, kind of where does the truth lie in this matter? Can we kind of aggregate all these different data sources together, then come to a picture, for example, in which regions might there be conflict, or later on, can we provide some early warning to people? Can we give advice to people what they should perhaps be worried about, or where they should not be worried? And I think through this way, you're kind of actually already thinking kind of in this distributed way. There's so many different sources. We should not assume they're all as reliable, but by using so many different sources, we can check them against each other. Are there very big outliers? Are there some sources that are agreeing with each other? And from that, we can come to those insights. And for this, we actually also get to a realization. We don't actually need to look at this data. We only need the information that's coming from the data. And that gives us actually a kind of map. It could be geospatial, because we through time, kind of what the consensus is around, for example, a region, a country, or even a continent. And through different statistical methods, such as aggregation, you can actually already come to pretty broad insights, and that can actually guide, for example, specialists to look at certain areas, certain diseases, and come to these insights that then warrant further research. So at the really basis of this is the question, how can we achieve both security and transparency? And of course, this is really often seen as kind of a dilemma. You can either have complete security, for example, if you work at the MOD, like everything is secret, hiding behind closets, hiding behind biometrics. You have a lot of things you need to go through, security screening. Or you have transparency, like open source, open data. And often it's seen these two are completely at odds with each other. But with this project, we show it's also possible to harmonize these two ideas together. You can have the security from the technological perspective, and also from the perspective of the architecture, just like Oliver showed, that all the data keeps in one place physically. It's secured inside of a system that's encrypted, and only parts of those data that are computed according to a transparent algorithm are then put into an intermediate storage that you can also see. So it's again transparent, and only that from the intermediate storage that can be shared, for example, to an aggregate dashboard. And then you can really get insight, for example, what is being computed and what is going outside with my permission, of course, while also keeping that data itself completely secure. That's kind of digitally isolated from the actual information that is kind of a product of the data. So you really have to keep those two ideas in mind, that we have data that's really the raw sample. For example, if we measure something, and also the information or the knowledge. So this is a product of the data. This no longer contains any private information, but this is information that describes the data. So for example, if you have a disease outbreak, you have the data. These are all patients that have a certain disease or they're diagnosed. This is secure. And then you have, for example, the information. For example, during this and this time, we saw a sudden increase in diagnosis of a certain disease in a certain region. And this could be, for example, if allowed, transparently communicated without compromising on security. So just a brief reminder that this is exactly what I described. Like you have different users or different locations. They can store their own data that's not shared, as shown, but from a kind of a single model specification that can be shared across different locations. We can come to models that are interoperable with each other. And these can then be harmonized into a single model where it is no longer known what parts are contributed by what user, even though you can analyze, is there some like agreement between the different parties, but the model that's actually aggregated together, this is a really bird's eye overview of what is happening in this community. And this allows individual users to compare how are our metrics compared to the, for example, global average. Should there be something we're concerned about? Should there something that warrants more research? And these are the types of questions that we really want to enable. So yeah, just a few of the positive effects of that. Of course, we can create hyper-personalized models. As you've seen, we can create internal dashboards for a specific instance or specific hospital or even specific person at the most personalized level. Of course, because all these computations are relatively small as compared to training a giant model, there's much lower overheads kind of inside each specific facility. We do not need to train the same model like 10 times just to give each facility's own model. You're training small things and then bringing them together. And also, of course, the most important aspects is privacy preserving, and this is really the security aspect. Yeah, so one topic I think that's especially relevant to what I said before, that there's kind of a gap or disconnect between one, you have the academic level, and one you have the level, for example, of industry, and for example, even perhaps the applied healthcare, like the daily healthcare usage. And there's kind of disconnect between how do we actually deal with data. The traditional way to deal with data, especially like if you look a couple of years back, like it was almost only data that was relational, and that means that the data is simply in a table, or for example in Excel files at the most extreme level. And that means that this data can just be read through with a static rule set, but it's not really, you can't really explore this data as a natural kind of structure where data strongly relates to each other. It's just a table, and each of those have their own kind of lack of hierarchical function. And what this means is that you cannot come to these insights with this data that you would come to, for example, if you require some notion of causality. And for example, of course, in healthcare, this is really important. For example, if a specific occurrence of an event causes the amount of disease to increase, for example, people are crammed together in a certain space, or there's a certain event, and then you see a sudden increase of disease, you want to be able to express this idea within a data set. And if you express this idea in a data set, you can explore it actually with the metadata itself. And this is where it becomes interesting, because you no longer need to actually see this data to be able to make this hypothesis. You can simply make a query that's based on this metadata, and this is being run locally. You get a result back, is this true or false? Or maybe you get a percentage probability that is true or false, or you get some information back. And this is how you can do a kind of scientific experiments without accessing this data. Of course, this disconnect, we see that there is a decrease, like there's an increased use of technology like Neo4j, MongoDB, and these are kind of relational graph databases. But there still exists this disconnect, and often this is also because people do not understand why do we actually need this. Why should I spend extra time making graph database? We need to make classes that relate to each other. We need to say, oh, this relates to that. For example, a car relates to 4 tires. It relates to a steering wheel and a motor. And how do those relate to, for example, passenger that's going to use it? But with a relational database, we can just clump it together with different columns, and we don't have to really care about that. So there is an overhead, and we need to be able to explain why that overhead is going to be worth it in the long run. And nowadays, like a lot more companies are understanding that this trade-off, like between ease of use early on or accepting the overhead, take a bit more time to get things running, and then be able to run it much more interoperably with other processes within the company, is definitely worth it. So I will just, it's quite long, so I'll just skip ahead a bit on my personal kind of research question, but I will talk also a bit about kind of how does this relate to each other? Of course, we're focused on fair, so we really care about the findability, the accessibility. So, for example, the controls of an access. I'm more focused on interoperability. So how do semantics embedded in the data, how can we use that? Of course, with indexing, how do we ultimately reuse this data? But this, of course, is sometimes interacting with the goals we have as a society. So we have, of course, data as property. And this strong data ownership, how does this relate to how we say how to access data, how to make data interoperable? And yeah, more relevant, perhaps at the direct level, are the laws and regulations we have to abide by. And these are set in stone often, but they're also changing, and they can change across countries. And this is something we have to be flexible for. So this is why also this access and control is quite a big research layer that really needs to be embedded both in the technology, but also at the policy level. And of course, we're dealing with a lot of legacy processes. And we can't just say these are invalid because people are doing those for a reason. But we also have to consider at what level do we have to still interact with those legacy processes, and in what level do we say, for example, you really have to replace this part, or you have to put this in addition, and also be able to explain why. Because it's very often much more difficult to get people to replace a legacy than just use something in addition. Yeah, so these are kind of the concerns that we have. And this is also the really, the breakaway point that Olivola also very well showed, that we really have these two components. The one is internally to generate the data on a fair basis. This is supported by CEDAR. And we also have the second component, to really to express that information refined from the data. So this is, I mean, it's kind of openly shown what this process is. And I think it's really important to continue asking questions like, how does it exactly work? Why is my privacy safeguarded? Why can my data not leave? And I think this, keeping asking questions, it also builds trust, because the more people understand the importance of this and also why these decisions have been made, the more people are willing to uptake this technology. And also ultimately what we want to achieve, that the increase in sharing of this information as a community. So just being able to connect different, not even different instances of hospitals, because that's already a level below what VODAN is doing, is connecting hospitals from different countries. And this is quite revolutionary that we have achieved so much already. And I also really would like to thank also Olivola, but also really Miriam for leadership, and of course Francisca and many more. Thank you. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you, Ruduan. Exciting to see this from where we started and where we are going. Really nicely set out. Let me ask if there are any comments, questions from the floor.
Really nice presentation, Ruduan, and indeed those efforts at federated learning, it's quite interesting, in terms of privacy preservation, which is a hallmark of patient data, right? So absolutely great work there. I'm happy to be part of this. Yeah.
Thank you, Kawu. Anyone else at this point? No, then I'm going to thank you again, Ruduan. I think it will make a very nice